Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Shivam, your host for this session on understanding the ArthurZero integration and who it is best suited for. I appreciate your time and participation. The webinar is expected to last an hour and will be recorded. By the end of the week, a recording will be sent out to all registered participants so you can review the content and share it with others. I want to encourage active engagement during the webinar. If you have any questions related to this topic, please utilize the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen and submit them. I'll be addressing your questions at the end of the session to ensure that we address any queries you have. In today's agenda, we will look at understanding the ArthurZero integration, the benefits of the integration. We'll look at an overview of how the integration works with a live example. We'll also look at a few tips when using the integration and also at who it is best suited for. So the first section of the agenda is understanding the ArthurZero integration. The relationship between Arthur and Xero is that Arthur operates as the invoice or bill generator. As you all know, in your Arthur account, you have properties, units, and tenancies set up. Within each section or each level of Arthur, you can add transactions or recurring charges. For example, in this tenancy on my screen, if I go into recurring charges, we can see in this section the recurring charges you have set up on your account. On this tenancy, we have a recurring charge of £825 generating on a monthly basis. The next collection date tells you when the next charge will be generated by the system. Under the description column, you can also see the transaction type. So this recurring charge will generate a direct rent on a monthly basis for the amount of £825. The recurring charge creates the charge automatically, and that will appear on the relevant statement. In this case, this is a charge related to the tenant. So that charge will appear on your tenant rent statement on the screen here. In terms of the ArthurZero integration, in this way, Arthur works as your invoice or bill generator, as you have your recurrings set up on Arthur. There is then an automatic sync that runs between Arthur and Xero. You can view that in your financial screen here. On your financials dashboard, in the middle of the screen, we have a mapping screen. So on that screen, if you click on Go to Xero Integration, you can view your mapping screen here, and this is where your automatic schedule syncs are. That's found in your synchronized history here. So under your financials, click on Go to Xero Screen. That will open your mapping screen here, and then click on Synchronize History. Here you can see the automatic sync that's scheduled on your account. On this account, it's scheduled to run every day at 6 a.m. So once Arthur creates the invoice or bill from your recurring charges, as I showed you here, the automatic sync will then sync that transaction across to Xero. On one of my tabs here, I have the Xero account open that's integrated to that specific Arthur account. On Xero, the function of Xero in the integration is Xero is where you have your live bank feed set up. So in your Xero screen here, if you go to your accounting and go into your bank accounts, you can view all your bank accounts and open your bank accounts where you have set up your live feed. On your live feed on the left-hand side, you can see all the bank lines coming in and out of your bank. So here you can see your spent items, your received items. This is a live feed, so it will be an automatic feed. So the left-hand side is your bank statements. The right-hand side will be your Arthur transactions. Once you're on your Xero and on your bank feed, you will then go through the process of matching your bank against your Arthur transactions on your right-hand side here. The sync works two ways. So once you go ahead and match a transaction on the right-hand side, a receipt will then sync back to Arthur and appear on your statements. I will go through a live example of the reconciliation process. So just to go back to Arthur and going into your statements, you can see an example here. This receipt has been created from Xero and has synced back to Arthur along with this receipt here. So to summarize, the relationship between the ArthurZero integration is that Arthur operates as your invoice and bill generator, where you add all your financial transactions. Automatic syncs are run between Arthur and Xero, which push those financial transactions across to Xero. Xero is where your bank feed is set up, where you will be carrying out your reconciliation process, essentially where you're matching your bank against your financial transactions that have generated from Arthur. And as the sync works two ways, that matching process will then push back receipts to Arthur to show those charges have been paid off. An example on my screen here. So that summarizes the ArthurZero integration. We will be looking at this in more detail. What we're going to speak about is the benefits of the ArthurZero integration. One of the big benefits is that it provides end-to-end financial management. As I've explained, transactions are raised in Arthur, pushed across to Xero. Payments are processed in Xero, which sync back to Arthur. Due to this integration, you will only be carrying out the reconciliation process once, which is going to be done on the Xero side. And as that creates receipts back in Arthur, you wouldn't have to reconcile in Arthur as well. If you were using Arthur and Xero separately with no integration, you would be manually creating receipts in Arthur, such as these receipts here. At the same time, you'll be manually raising invoices on Xero and also reconciling on Xero. So without the integration, you're reconciling on two systems. With integration, you have the ability to just reconcile on Xero, which will all reflect back to Arthur. Another advantage of the Xero integration is it keeps your financials up to date on Arthur. As I mentioned, on Xero, you have the ability to set up a live bank feed. So you can connect your bank to Xero, where you can see your bank lines feeding into Xero automatically. The reconciliation process, as I explained, then reflects back in Arthur and updates your Arthur financials. So in this way, it helps you keep your financials up to date real time due to the live bank feed feature you have on Xero. Before I move on to the next section where I'll be working on a live example of how you use the integration together and also work on a few reconciliations, I will just quickly explain the mapping screen. So your ArthurZero mapping screen is found, as I said, in your financial dashboard. Go to Xero screen. These are your 6 sections that need to be mapped to get your Arthur account integrated to Xero. So the first section, which is your mapping account section, involves mapping your Arthur transaction types, which are on the left-hand side, against your Xero chart of accounts on the right-hand side. So the reason we need to map your Arthur transaction types is because this will determine where in Xero your transactions are syncing across to in your financial statements. For example, in this example, we raised a direct rent reoccurring, which is a rent transaction type used by landlords using Arthur. So that raises your rental invoices. Rental invoices for landlords are accounted for as an income or revenue. So here you can see direct rent will usually be mapped to a sales nominal code on your chart of accounts. And you can see it will always give you a small description on what that nominal code is on Xero. So this is telling us that the sales nominal is added on Xero as a revenue account. So any direct rents you raise on Arthur will be syncing into this specific nominal code on Xero on your financial statement. So your mapping account section determines where in your financial statements your transaction types in Arthur will be syncing across to. Mapping bank accounts. So this is just to match your Arthur bank accounts to your Xero bank accounts. I know your Xero bank accounts, as we mentioned, are set up on Xero where you have a live feed. We still need to add those bank accounts in Arthur. The reason for that is because when you reconcile a payment on Xero, Arthur needs to know what bank that payment was received in. So when you go ahead in Xero and reconcile a payment coming in this specific bank account, as the bank accounts are mapped here, Arthur will be able to tell which bank that receipt is assigned to when that payment syncs back to Arthur. So that's the purpose of matching your bank accounts. Mapping tenancies, and contacts. With the integration, tenancies are classed as customers on Xero. So as you know, you all have tenancies set up on Arthur. At the same time, you still have the same tenant contacts on Xero as well, which is in this screen here. So your tenants on Arthur are linked to specific contacts on Xero as well, Xero tenant contacts. So essentially, you will have a tenant rent statement in Arthur. At the same time, you will also have a tenant ledger on Xero. Tenancies on Xero, like I said, are customers. So all tenants added on Arthur are treated as customers on Xero, which means any transactions you'll be raising or any charges you'll be raising against tenancies on Arthur will be invoices, as those relate to a customer tenant contact on Xero. On the other hand, mapping contacts include your property owners and your contractors. These will be your suppliers on Xero. So all your contractors that you've added on Arthur and all your landlords you have added on Arthur have corresponding contacts on Xero as well, which will be your supplier contacts as well on Xero. So that means any transactions you'll be raising on Arthur against contractors or property owners will be classed as a bill or a bill credit if it's a credit note. So those are your contacts. So tenancies are customers, contractors and property owners are suppliers as part when you're dealing with Arthur and Xero. Your mapping unit screen shows what properties and units on Arthur are linked to your tracking categories on Xero. So on Xero, we have something called tracking categories. You can find that in your settings section here. So if you click on your entity name on Xero, go to settings. Here you can see if you go to advanced settings and then go to tracking categories there, you can see a list of your 2 tracking categories. By default, if you don't have custom tracking category set up, you will always have units as your primary tracking category and properties as your secondary tracking category. So the reason we have tracking categories mapped is because on Arthur, anytime you raise a transaction against a specific property or a specific unit on Arthur, when that financial transaction syncs across to Xero, it will be assigned to a primary tracking category, which is your unit, and your secondary tracking category, which is your property. The reason this is helpful is because you can then run reports on tracking categories to view performance. So for example, you can run a report on your property tracking category. So you can run a profit and loss report on this specific property, which will include all the financial transactions you raised on Arthur. It will include all your revenues, which are your rents that you've collected, and all your expenses, which would be things like your your contractor payments, for repairs and maintenance. So in this way, tracking categories can be quite helpful to view performance. Lastly, here we have a sync history tab. As I mentioned before, this is where you schedule your automatic sync. So if you want to see when your syncs are running on your Arthur account, go into your sync history and it will tell you at the top of the screen here when your automatic syncs are running on a daily basis. You also have an option of running a manual sync. As you can see, this is a sync that runs every 24 hours. So the way the sync works is it always syncs from the last update made on the system. So if you don't want to wait for the next day at 6 a.m. for your data to your financial transactions or any data to sync across, you do have an option of going into synchronize here and running a manual sync yourself. You will see these buttons here. I think for on your account, you will only see the sync all records for the last 3 months. We always advise not to tick these boxes. The reason is ticking sync all records will sync all your financial transactions generated on your Arthur account in the last that have been generated on your Arthur account the last 3 months. So it will take a lot longer than just a normal sync, which will always sync from the last update. So there is no need to tick these boxes here. So you can just go ahead and press synchronize straight away. So that is an overview of ArthurZero, the relationship between Arthur and Xero, and how the two systems are linked together. Going into the next section of the agenda, we'll now look at an overview of the ArthurZero integration and how it works. So we'll look at a live example of Arthur and Xero, where we have a few rental charges created, and we'll go into Xero and reconcile those charges. So I've got a tenancy set up that has a few charges created where we can go and match them on Xero, so you can see how the sync works. The first example we'll look at is how to reconcile a rent on Xero when the full rent has been paid correctly to your bank account. So here you can see an example. We've got a few monthly rents of £825. This is the rent the tenant is due to pay every month. And this has generated on your statements from your recurring charges here. So going into Xero and then going into our live feed, we can see here we have received a few rents from the tenant. So this screen here, like I said, is your bank statement. So it will always show what the tenant has added as the description on the payment. So when they make the payment of the rent, they usually add a description, so it will show that. It can be quite useful if, they can add in the tenancy numbers, because every tenancy on Arthur has a individual tenancy number, which you can see at the top of your screen here. So if they add that in the description, it makes the reconciliation easier. So you can easily identify the tenancy number here when you're trying to match the transaction, just to ensure you are matching the correct rents. So here we have on the 1st of May, the tenant paid £825. We know we want to match that against this transaction here. As we can see, that's overdue, but that payment has come in. So the process is we can find this transaction on Xero on the matching screen and then reconcile it, and then a receipt like this will come back to Arthur to show that rent has been paid. There are a few ways you can try search for this transaction. You can either take this transaction number from Arthur, because every transaction that syncs from Arthur to Xero will have that corresponding transaction number on Xero. So if you go into find and match here, we'll try find that transaction on Xero. Just refresh my screen. So once the bank loads up on Xero, I'll go ahead and match the rents for you and then run a sync to show you how that rent syncs back to Arthur. I will be looking at a few examples in terms of reconciliation. The first example I'll look at is when a full rent has been paid. So the full £825 has been paid into the bank. Then I'll look at receiving an underpayment. So let's say they pay 800 instead of 825, how to reconcile underpayments of rent. And then we'll also look at an example of a rent overpayment where the tenant has overpaid their rent. We can also then go ahead and process the refund for the overpaid amount, or I can show you how to allocate that overpayment to the next month's rent if you don't want to do a refund straight away. So going back into the bank, click on Find and Match. So as we said, you can use the transaction number to search for that payment. So here, if we go there, click on that payment and then click on Reconcile. So that's how you reconcile a payment that has been paid exactly into the bank. Before I run the sync, I will just show you how to reconcile the underpayment as well and the overpayment, and then I can run the sync at once and show you how all those three scenarios sync back to Arthur. The next example is a part payment. So someone has underpaid or part paid their rent. As we know, we want to match that against this transaction here. So in June, we have a rent coming in for £800, but the rent is actually £825. So again, I can take the transaction number. Another way you can actually search for this is actually search for the tenancy name. So if I go into Xero and click on Find and Match, obviously you might not want to keep going back into Arthur to get the transaction number each time. So you can even just search for the tenancy name here. So that's what I've added as a tenancy name, and you can see all the available invoices you have on Xero to match against this rent. You do have to ensure you are selecting the correct one. So in this case, I want the 1st of June one, and that is the transaction number I copied. Click on that. In this case, as we know, as it's a part payment, what we do is we use this split function on Xero, which will automatically split this invoice to create a payment of 800, leaving £25 outstanding. If I click on split, and Xero will automatically calculate the payment amount and the remaining outstanding amount. Click on split and then reconcile. When we sync that back to Arthur, we will see that that transaction here will still have £25 outstanding because we only processed a payment of 800. The last scenario is doing a overpayment. So we have £825 rent in July as well, but on the bank we can see we've received £850. So they have actually overpaid by £25. The process is, again, clicking on Find and Match, searching for the invoice. Again, you can search for the tenancy name. Another way you can search is also by the amount. So if you know what the rent amount is, 825, it will show you all the invoices on your account that are still outstanding for 825, and we know this is the right one, TR407396, which relates to this one here. So we then click on that. So we have now an invoice of 825, but we have a payment of 850. As you can see, Xero is telling you that the match is still out by £25. The way we deal with that is we now need to process an overpayment to show this is a rent overpayment, which will also sync back to Arthur. So the way we do that is in our second section here, click on New Transaction and click on Receive Money. On the screen here, change the received as to received as overpayment because this is a rent overpayment. And then another important thing to do here is to select the tenancy contact on Xero as I said in the mapping screen, every tenancy on Arthur has a linked tenancy on Xero. So we have to make sure we're selecting that linked tenant contact on Xero because that's what is mapped back to Arthur. So if we want this £25 overpayment to reflect back to Arthur, we have to make sure we select the linked tenancy, the mapped tenancy related to the tenancy in Arthur. So one way you can do that is taking the tenancy number and just pasting it here, and that will give you the linked tenancy. Every tenancy on Xero has two contacts. One will be a deposit contact, one will be a rent contact. You want this to sync back to the tenant rent statement, so always select the rent contact. If we select that by mistake, that will actually sync back to the deposit statement, but because this is overpaid rent, we select the rent contact. Finally, once this is done, you click on Save Transaction. And here we can see we have two transactions we've created. One is a payment of £8.25 and one is an overpayment of £25, which we then go and match here. Now that we've done these three scenarios, I'll go ahead and run a sync. And this is a good tip to show you how to run a manual tenancy sync. As previously explained, we have three types of sync. The third type of sync is individual tenancy syncs, when you don't want to sync your entire financials and all your tenancies and property transactions. You can just choose to sync that individual tenancy with Xero, and that's done from the tenancy level, the mode dropdown, sync with Xero, and then just go ahead and run a sync here. This sync will sync all the different modes we have. So, and you can also choose to sync a specific mode as well if you want, depending on what you're trying to sync. For example, if you just want to sync a specific invoice that you've created, like let's say a one-off rent charge or a one-off sundry charge that you've created on the statement directly, you can just choose to sync invoice, and that will just sync that specific mode to Xero. You can choose to sync only payments. If you've gone into Xero, reconciled a few rents like we've done, you can choose just to select payment and run a sync. That will only sync the payments mode. Here you can see it is syncing all the modes one by one in this order. Overpayment mode will sync back that £25 rent overpayment we just processed. Credit notes sync any charge credits you've created against the tenant. Let's say you create a bad debt write-off, which is a charge credit, that will sync across in the credit note mode. You can also sync deposits and the tenant remittance mode. So I think what we need should have already synced over. So if I refresh my screen, on the screen, we'll now see the transactions that have generated from Xero, specifically the payments that have generated from Xero from the reconciliation process we've just carried forward. So here we can see the May example was a full rent payment where we just matched the $8.25 against $8.25 received in the bank. June rent was an part payment where we used the split function. In this case, you see the part payment synced from Xero, so £25 is still outstanding on Xero, making up that outstanding balance here. The July payment was the overpayment. So here we can see July rent was $8.25. $8.25 was paid on the 1st of July. But at the same time, on the 1st of July, we processed a £25 overpayment, which is also reflected on Arthur. So by doing that process of creating an overpayment on Xero, when you have a rent overpayment, the extra £25 overpayment, as you can see, syncs across as a separate line. So you have one line, which is the full $8.25, and on top of that, you have an extra line, which reflects the £25 overpayment on Xero, which is this one here. A quick tip is you can see what charge each receipt is related to. So, for example, 1st of May tenancy receipt, rent payment, it tells you the charge reference here, which will always relate to the charge it's paying off and the charge it's allocated to. So this is how any receipt that syncs or any payment or receipt that syncs from Xero back to Arthur will always come back with a charge reference explaining or telling you which charge it is linked to and which charge it is allocated to. So that's one thing to look out for because it makes it easier if you want to see which payments are paying which charges on the system. So these are examples of reconciliations. One more scenario I can look at now is going back to the overpayment. In July, we went through an example of a tenant overpaying their rent. So for example, July rent was meant to be £825. The tenant paid 850, which we reconciled on Xero, creating an £825 receipt, and at the same time, creating an overpayment of £25. We'll now look at how to deal with this overpayment. So there are a few options here. One of the options is you can choose to allocate this £25 to the next month's rent or to any other outstanding rents you have on the statement. That way, it's paying off any outstanding charges you already have. The way you do that is you just go to the drop down on the overpayment where you can see there's still an outstanding balance. Click on the drop down and click on allocate to charge. Clicking on that will then give you options of any charges on the statement that are still outstanding where you can allocate this credit to. So we can go there and put in the £25 and allocate. Doing that will pay this off. So it goes down to 0 and will also pay off this £25 here. The second option is the tenant might just want a refund. So you might have to pay the tenant back £25. So obviously you go into your bank, you make that payment, and now on your bank you have a £25 spent item, which is a refund for the overpayment. The way you process that refund is all done through Xero. So we have to create a refund on Xero to match against this overpayment. So the way you do that is you need to go to the tenant contact on Xero to process the refund, where we'll be able to find that £25 overpayment. So go into contacts, tenants. All these groups here relate to groups that are linked back to Arthur. So all your tenants here are mapped to tenancies on Arthur. All your property owner and contractor contacts here are mapped back to landlord and contractor contacts on Arthur. So it's quite helpful if you're searching for any Arthur related contacts. You can just look at these groups and track them back to Arthur. So we need to find this tenancy on Arthur. So you can find the tenancy number TE1447. And here we can see that tenancy. So like I said, you have your tenant rent statement on Arthur. You also have a tenant ledger for the same tenancy in Xero. And you can see the outstanding amount is the same. So this should always match this here because the systems are in sync. Everything you do in Arthur should reflect in Xero and vice versa. So on here, we can find the £25 overpayment. So this £25 overpayment that we created, we click into it, and this is where we would go ahead and process a cash refund. At the bottom here to match against this £25 refund we have on the bank. So anytime you've processed an overpayment for on Arthur, on Xero, which has synced back to Arthur, and now you're refunding that overpayment back to the tenant, this will be the process. So on here, we have the cash refund. This is where we process the refund. This is the amount. This is the date. We can see this was sent on the 2nd of July. And here we have to select the bank we're making the refund from. So we have to make sure we are choosing this bank here because that's where a refund payment will be created for us to match against this bank line. So it says Aston Chase client on here, Aston Chase client account, and then here you can just say refund and press add refund. When you add a refund, that will create a cash refund on your bank here as well. So going back into your bank reconciliation and refreshing, we should now have a cash refund on the bank available for us to match against the actual bank line. So we'll just wait for that to refresh. Another thing is when a sync is run, that refund will also sync back to Arthur. So over here, that is a £25 overpayment we process the refund from on Xero. So what's going to happen is when the next sync runs, another line will be created, which will probably have a description of Xero refund, which will be allocated to this to show on Arthur that that £25 has also been sent back to the tenant. So going back into Xero, going in here. So as you can see straight away, that process we did has created this refund for us that we put a reference and we just go ahead and match that. So we've completed that refund and that will also sync back to Arthur. I'll run a sync now just so you can see that coming back to Arthur. So that completes the section. I will come back to this tenancy once the sync is over so you can see that line of the refund being created. So we've gone through an overview of the integration with a live example. In terms of tips of using the ArthurZero integration, there's a few useful tips that will prevent errors when you're using the two systems together. So the first thing to understand is regarding using the integration is when you're using Arthur and Xero together and you're obviously adding transactions in Arthur, which is syncing across to Xero. Once a transaction has already synced across to Xero, you can't edit that transaction. And it's something we don't recommend because the sync can't deal with edits. So for example, we have these transactions here, which let's say have synced across to Xero already. If we want to edit this transaction here, maybe change the description, we can do it. So if you go to edit transaction, and let's say we change something in description or we change the date of the transaction, when a sync is run, those edits you've made in Arthur will not make the same edits on that invoice on Xero. So what we always recommend is if you need to make any changes to the transaction, always void the transaction and re-add it from add transaction. Always avoid editing a transaction once it's already synced across to Xero. Another tip would be manual syncs, which we've gone through. You can find a manual sync in your financial dashboard. Go to Xero screen from here, where you can see the automatic sync, and you can also run a manual sync like I explained earlier. And at the same time, you can also run a individual tenancy sync like I've been doing for this example, which is in the tenancy level, the more drop-down menu and sync with Xero. So the manual syncs are quite helpful if you don't want to wait for the next sync to run. Maybe let's say the next morning and you want to work on your recs and you have data that is waiting to sync over. You don't always have to wait for the next day. You can go ahead and run a manual sync. Just remember to never tick the boxes here and just to go and run the syncs straight away. Another tip is if you've incorrectly reconciled something, so while doing your reconciliation process on Xero, like I've been doing, you're matching the bank to the transactions in Arthur by pressing OK, which have synced back receipts. If you've realized that you've reconciled a rent that has come in against the wrong transaction in the bank, you need to remove the payment from Xero, which will then remove the payment in Arthur automatically in the sync. So if you're on Arthur and you realize this is not actually the payment that was meant to pay off this invoice, it should be for another tenancy. You can't remove this payment directly on Arthur by going into an allocate and voiding. It will flag up an error message because this payment has been created from Xero. So the process would be to go into Xero and remove and redo this payment on Xero. So you can go into the bank statement. You can find that payment. So let's say it's this one here. Here you can see all your reconciled payments and your unreconciled payments as well. So let's say this is the one that you've reconciled incorrectly. Just click into it and then click on remove and redo. When a sync runs, either you're running a manual one or an automatic sync runs, remove and redo will then automatically remove this payment from Arthur as well. And that invoice will be fully outstanding. So removing payments, if you're integrated with Xero, you can't remove them from Arthur. You have to use the remove and redo functionality on Xero to remove them on Arthur. That way, that is just a control in the integration to ensure, Arthur and Xero is always matching. Otherwise, if you're removing payments on Arthur and also removing payments on Xero, that could lead to discrepancies. So we always suggest use remove and redo on Xero, and that will automatically remove the payments from Arthur. Another thing is you will also see this option of unreconcile, which some people can use to remove a payment, but we always recommend using remove and redo instead, because what unreconcile does is it will bring back the payment to the bank here, but it won't actually delete the payment. We want the payment fully deleted because you're usually going to re-reconcile and recreate a new payment. So that's why I always say always use remove and redo instead of unreconcile, which will bring the payment back to the bank for you to reconcile it again against the correct invoice, but it won't actually delete the payment from the system. Remove and redo will bring the payment back to the bank in your reconciliation screen so you can match it again, but at the same time, it will void the payment, which will then void the payment in Arthur in the sync. So those are just a few tips of when using the ArthurZero integration. Lastly, the last bit is who is best suited for Arthur and Xero. I would say a landlord setup or a rent-to-rent setup would be best suited for the ArthurZero integration because of the way the syncs work. However, if you are a property manager, you can still use the ArthurZero integration. It does definitely work for property managers as well. But we always recommend using the Arthur bank feed for a property manager setup where you can set up your client bank account directly on Arthur. So if you're a property manager and have a specified client account, you can just set up your client account, bank account directly in Arthur and reconcile it there. In that case, you don't need to be integrated with Xero. So we always say that the ArthurZero integration best works for landlords using Arthur or for rent-to-rent guaranteed rent schemes using Arthur and Xero, and property managers would usually use the Arthur bank feed, where you can set up and reconcile your client bank account, and you don't need to reconcile your client account on Xero directly. That can be done in Arthur. But saying that, the ArthurZero integration also works for a property manager setup, so that would still be okay. So that just comes to the end of the agenda. I can see a few questions have been posted on the chat. If you still have any more questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom link. I'll just go through those questions now and answer them for you. So the first question is, Will I need to manually and constantly map contacts and tenancies, or does it happen automatically? So that is a good question. We looked at the mapping screen in the financials and go to Xero screen here, where we looked at mapping tenancies and mapping contacts, also mapping units. I know you're constantly adding new properties, new units, new tenancies on Arthur. So the way the sync is designed is any new properties, units, or tenancies you add on Arthur, the sync will actually automatically create those contacts for you on Xero. So you don't have to go into Xero, go into contacts and add a tenancy contact in there, and then go back to the mapping screen and map it manually. So it is an automatic process. Once you add a tenancy on Arthur, or even a property owner or a contractor, the sync will automatically create those contacts for you and also map them for you. So that's an automatic process. Another question is there a reconciliation that compares Arthur and Xero? My concern is that there may be a risk that an invoice transaction may be deleted in one system and not another. You can do an audit check to make sure Arthur matches Xero. One quick thing you can do is use our financial dashboard here, where you can see a snapshot of your unpaid invoices. So unpaid invoices will just relate to any outstanding invoices you have on related to tenants, both rents and deposits in here. So that will give you a total amount. This amount can be compared to your awaiting payment amount on Xero, on the Xero dashboard. So I'll just wait for that to load up. While that is loading up, there's another way to do it is through reporting. You can run a few reports on Arthur that you can compare to, let's say, your receivables report on Xero or your payables report on Xero. So for example, if you go to reports there, see if that's, so just quickly coming back to this point, on your financial dashboard, your unpaid tenant invoices should be close to your invoices here. But obviously on Xero, because Xero is related to your entire business and not just your Arthur generated transactions, there will usually be a difference here because you might be raising invoices against something else that's not related to Arthur and raising bills against overheads for your business that are not actually property related. So it won't match like for like straight away. You can run a receivables report though from here, age receivables report on Xero, and you can compare that to your age tenant balance report on Arthur. So if you go to reports, financials, age tenant balance report, it gives you a list of all the tenancies and all the balances for each tenancy. So you can run that report on Arthur, which can be compared to your receivables report on Xero here. So the two balances can match. So the receivables report on Xero, you can see it shows you all your tenancies and the balances for each tenancy. Just make sure you're running both reports for the same period. So, if you want to run the report as of today, just select today there and update. So it will show you all the balances for all your tenancies line by line, which can be cross-checked against this report on Arthur, age tenant balance report, which shows you the same thing. Just make sure on Xero, because like I said, Xero is accounting for your entire business. It could include some contacts that may not be linked back to Arthur, so just filter those off the report. One way to cross-check is all tenants that have come in from Arthur into Xero will have those individual IDs. So this is an Arthur linked contact. So that's one way you can do it. So before you actually start comparing, maybe just have a quick look and remove any non-mapped customer contacts. You could have a contact on Xero. You're raising invoices against that contact, but that's not actually a linked contact or anything related back to Arthur. So it just needs to be removed from that report before you cross-check it against your age tenant balance, which will only show Arthur tenancies and Arthur customers. You can do the same thing for contractors, for your supplier side. If you go to financials and look at unpaid contractor bills here, it'll show you a list of all your unpaid contractor transactions on Arthur. That can be compared against your age payables report on Xero. But again, same thing, just remove any non-Arthur mapped supplier contacts, and that way you can be able to compare the two together. Another question is, can you individually sync a landlord's record for when you're doing landlord remittances, or do you just do this from the tenancy screen? For example, if you just wanted to sync one account. Unfortunately, you can't sync individual landlords like you can sync individual tenancies. What you can do though is if you just want to sync a property on a remittance that you've created on Arthur, you can go to financials, go to Xero screen, click on synchronize and sync PO transactions here. Syncing that mode on its own will only sync all property owner transactions, including the property owner remittances you've processed on the system. You can't sync an individual property owner like we can sync individual tenancies, but this mode will allow you just to sync, let's say, property owner remittances if you don't want to sync anything else on the system. So yeah, you can use this mode here. If you can't see this drop-down list of mode, just make sure you have this box unticked and enable payments restriction. If it's not appearing as a drop-down list, it's probably because you have this ticked. So just go into your settings, untick that and save. And then you should be able to see the drop-down list here. And you should just be able to sync your property owner transactions, which is syncing all your landlord remittances you've processed. Another question is, with refunds, is it the same as if we're refunding a holding deposit that a tenant has paid and has not been successful? Yes, it is a similar process. The only difference with that is the way we deal with holding deposits, similar to rent overpayments. We would reconcile those as overpayments on your bank feed on Xero. So what we recommend is when a holding deposit is paid into Arthur, you don't usually have an invoice to match against that holding deposit because your deposit charge may not have already been created. So you would have, let's say, this is a holding deposit. The way we reconcile holding deposits is use find and match. You don't usually have an invoice to match against that deposit. So you're creating the full amount as an overpayment. So from the second section there, new transaction, receive money, and then change this to overpayment. Same process as we did for the rent overpayment. So with the holding deposit, it depends how you want to deal with that deposit. Does that deposit contribute to the full deposit charge, or does it contribute to the first month's rent? Depending on which one it is which section you select here. So for example, going back to that example, let's just find that tenancy again. So if let's say this tenant has paid a holding deposit, we take that tenancy number like we did for the rents, we put that in there. And like I said, this is linking back to the tenant rent statement. This is linking back to the tenant deposit statement. So if we choose the first one, that £1,000 will sync back to the tenant rent statement here as a credit overpayment. If you choose the second contact, which is a deposit contact, that £1,000 will sink to the deposit statement here as a credit. So it depends how you deal with the holding deposit. If that holding deposit is a part payment or a payment in advance for your deposit charge, and you need to allocate that to a deposit charge you'll raise in the future, then choose the deposit contact here. So that credit syncs back to your deposit statement and you can match it. If your holding deposit contributes to your first month's rent, use that contact, and that £1,000 holding deposit will sync back to your tenant rent statement as a credit here, and you can allocate it to your rent. So that's how you deal with holding deposits. In terms of the refund, so if that didn't go through, the process is exactly the same. Find the overpayment on Xero by going into the tenancy contact like we did and process a cash refund, just like we did for that rent overpayment. So in that sense, in the sense of processing the refund, it's the same process. The only thing that changes when you're adding the overpayment to the start is where you want that overpayment or holding deposit to reflect, either on the deposit statement or on the tenant statement. Next question, what is the difference between direct rent and rent charge? Difference between direct rent and rent charge is direct rent is a revenue and income. So you would use direct rent if you're using Arthur as a landlord, or if you're operating on a rent-to-rent guaranteed rent scheme, which means the rent you're collecting is your income and revenue. You're keeping it into your bank. You're not, paying it across to a landlord. So you are the landlord yourself. So that £825 will be your revenue if it's a direct rent. If a rent charge is if you're using Arthur as a property manager, that £825 you're collecting is payable to the landlord. So you're passing that rent across to the landlord, minus any deductions or management fees and things like that. So direct rent is income and rent charge is a liability used when you're using Arthur as a property manager. Next question, how do we allocate overpayments to a future rent? For example, the next month. Yeah, so the way you allocate an overpayment to a future rent is from the drop down. So once the overpayment has generated, it will appear on your statement here as a credit. So it'll be minus 25. The reason this is because we processed a refund, which has actually synced back now. But it will appear, so let's say that's an overpayment. It will appear like this on your statement. So you can either wait for the next month to generate. So in this case, the next month will generate on the 1st of September. So the system will create a rent on your account here on the 1st of September. You'll then be able to allocate this overpayment to that rent from the drop down, allocate to charge. So if you want to wait for the next month, you can do that. If you want to process a refund, you can do that. If you want to generate this charge earlier as well, you can do that. So you don't want to wait till the 1st of September. You just want to generate that charge now. You can just go into the recurring charge here, drop down days in advance. So 31st. So we can add a days in advance to generate this charge, these number of days in advance. Let's just put 40 days in advance. That will generate the rent the direct rent early on your statement, where we can then now have that rent invoice available to allocate against that overpayment. So we can see now that's been generated. So now we have the option of allocating this to this from the drop down, allocate to charge, and put 175 and allocate. So the next month, the tenant will pay 650 and you'll be able to match 650 against the tenant payment on Xero. Another question is, at times I cannot find the correct transaction in Xero for reconciliation. This appears to be random currently. So I'm guessing that's referring to maybe in some instances, for whatever reason, you have charges on Arthur, but you can't find them on Xero. They they might have not synced over for whatever reason. When that happens, I would suggest the first thing to do is look at your mappings, make sure everything is mapped. The things you have to double check is make sure your transaction type is mapped and also make sure the tenancy is mapped. So when you have a charge on Arthur, you have a payment on Xero, but you can't see that charge on Xero because it hasn't synced over. Go to your mapping screen, and the first thing to check is just make sure your transaction type is matched. So if your charge is added as a direct rent, make sure it's mapped on Xero. If it's like this, it means it's not mapped and you need to map it. And also, secondly, make sure your tenancy contact is mapped. For maybe some reason, it might have become unmapped or someone unmapped it. When any of those two things are unmapped, that transaction will not sync across to Xero. So that could be a reason why something is not syncing across. So those are the two things to look out for in your mapping screen to fix any issues with transactions not syncing across to Xero. If you still have issues and you don't see it, I would just say come into our support system and we'll investigate it for you. Next question, is there a way contractor invoices or receipts can be scanned onto Arthur the same way as they're scanned in Xero? Unfortunately not. I'm guessing you're referring to external systems integrating to Xero or connected to Xero, maybe Receipt Bank or a system like that where you can email Xero an invoice or a contractor invoice or a bill, which then goes into your drafts in your bills to pay, which you then approve and creates that transaction on Xero. Unfortunately, we don't have that functionality where you can link that system to Arthur so that transaction comes into Arthur automatically. In that case, maybe something to think about is whether you want those bills to come into Xero directly and then maybe from Xero sync back to Arthur, rather than raising it in Arthur, syncing it across to Xero. We would only do that for the supply side though, so that can only be an option for contractors where you have a contractor bill or invoice, you email it to Xero through Receipt Bank, that gets added on Xero automatically and attached. And then if your mappings are correct, that can go back to Arthur. So that is an option if you want to use systems like that. But we can't link those systems to Arthur directly. What if a tenant pays deposit and rent at the same time? In that scenario, you would have two lines. You would have, so let's say this is a deposit and a rent payment. You would have two transactions to match against that one payment, which you can do. So for example, let's just find any two. £1,000 was paid in. That's the rent. Let's say that's the rent. And then let's find a deposit. You'll just see them as two separate lines on the screen here, and you will be able to select both of them. So let's say that's a deposit. Select both of them. They would add up to that amount. And then that way you can select both invoices and match them to one payment. It will create two receipts in Arthur. One will go to the deposit statement and one will go to the tenant statement. So in the case where you're receiving one payment related to two invoices, deposit and rent, you just have to go into your matching here and select the rent invoice, the deposit invoice, and then you'll be able to match it. Next question. The rent reminders that automatically get sent out to tenants regarding overdue. How do we see that in Arthur? Is there a way to control when it's sent and when it can be turned off. The way you see that is go to your Arthur, click on your Arthur entity, top left-hand side, and then click on email and SMS history. Any automations you have set up, you can see a history of where and who they've been sent to and when as well. So if you click on email sent and SMS is sent, it should give you a list of everything that has been sent out to tenants, to landlords, to contractors. So this way you can see a history of what is being sent out. If you want to turn it off, you can do that as well through your automation screen here. So click on automation. And then disable automation. That will turn off any automatic rent reminders and emails and SMSs that are getting sent out to tenants and landlords and anyone. So you can disable it, and also if you want to turn it back on, you can come back here and enable it as well. Next question, can you reconcile prepayments to Arthur? Unfortunately not. So I know what you mean. So if you go to Xero and go to find and match, and then go to receive money here when you're creating a rent overpayment, I know you have that option of prepayments. You can't use that, unfortunately. You have to reconcile it as an overpayment. The reason for that is because the sync currently can't read prepayment. So if you go ahead and create it as a prepayment and add the tenancy correctly here, unfortunately, it will not sync back to Arthur, and you will have a discrepancy between the two systems because you'll have a prepayment in Xero adding to the tenant balance, but you won't have that in Arthur. So unfortunately, you can't use prepayments, or always use overpayments to for even if you receive something in advance. You can't use a prepayment. Unfortunately, you would have to reconcile that as an overpayment on Xero for it to reflect back to Arthur. Another question is, if an invoice is paid from an intercompany account on Xero rather than a bank receipt, does it sync back to Arthur? So you can, only if it's mapped, only if that intercompany nominal code is mapped. We don't recommend this though. We always say always generate your receipts and payments from a bank account. But if you do need to process some payments into, like, let's say, an intercompany loan account, you just have to make sure it's mapped back to Arthur, and you can process payments to that intercompany loan account. So for example, if I go and maybe find one, if there is one available. So let's say that's an intercompany liability loan account. If you want to process payments to nominal codes rather than bank accounts, it's not recommended. But if you have to and you need that to reflect back to Arthur, make sure you've ticked this box here, enable payments to this account. So you go to the chart of accounts, go to the nominal code and tick this box here and click on save. When you do that, you need to go back into Arthur and set up a bank account for that intercompany loan account, which you do from bank accounts. And again, obviously, it's not an actual bank account, but because of the way Arthur works, Arthur needs to look at it as a bank account. So then click on add bank account and maybe just add something like intercompany loan account, add a dummy bank account essentially. When you add it on Arthur, go to financials, go to Xero screen, mapping bank accounts. You will see that bank account appear here, and then you'll be able to find that loan account here as well and map it. So it will only sync back if you have that intercompany loan account mapped back to Arthur. Again, not recommended, but if you have to do it, you can make it work in this way. Add it in Arthur as a bank account. Make sure you have it ticked in here on Xero, enable payments. And then if you go back to Arthur, you will be able to find it in this list in your mapping bank accounts. Any payments you process against that will then sync back to Arthur. And that answers the final question. So thank you all for watching. Just a quick request, you will get a feedback survey, which will just be a quick feedback on how you found this webinar. So it'd be really helpful for us if you rate the webinar so we can know for the future how to improve it going forward. So thank you for all your time.